Welcome to Voices of IFES. In this episode of World Assembly Talks, you're going to hear from Naomi Chandrasekharan. She's a zoology student and actively involved with Focus Sri Lanka. She explores how Psalm 16 can help us keep contented in and committed to God, our refuge.
As I reflect on all that we've been through in the past 4 years, not only as a nation, but as a global community, I couldn't think of a better theme than what's been chosen for this year's World Assembly. Steadfast and resilient, as the words Taba dan Tangu translate, seem to capture the mindset and attitude we must take on as we press on forward. Not only have times been challenging, but it's almost as if the moment we've got a grasp of things, there is once again a shift in the playing field. And so we find ourselves in the midst of constantly shifting situations, sometimes desperately trying hard to hold on to whatever it is that will keep us going. Perhaps this is what David felt when he spoke the words, "Keep me safe, my God, for in you I take refuge." Here we find not only a request for safety, but also a declaration of who God is to David, a safe place. I wonder how many of us can honestly look at our own lives and say that God is our first go-to place in the midst of difficulties and trial. I look at my own life and honestly see so many places where I tend to struggle on my own before I come to God. And oftentimes, I'm figuring it out on my own or running to other people or methods. But I've realized that in the process of when I finally come to God in my struggle, I realize who God can be to me personally, and I know Him on a personal level. It is in the face of rejection and loneliness that we discover what a friend we have in Jesus. It is in the middle of chaos that we discover the peace that He offers. And times of sadness and sorrow, we meet the God of comfort. And in the midst of times where we feel unsafe or uncertain or insecure, we find a safe place in Him. As you reflect upon your own lives and ministries, who has God been to you personally? What confident declaration of God are you able to make today as a result of your experience with Him? The deeper we know God, the more we are able to attest to His character and goodness, even when situations around us seem bleak. And like in any relationship, the depth and strength of a friendship is built with experience, familiarity, intentionality, and effort. Having said that, how are we making the space to meet with God and to just be and rest in His presence? Do we invite Him into the daily and seemingly mundane activities of our lives? It is in that close and intimate relationship with God that David expresses his ultimate form of delight when he says, "You are my God. Apart from you, I have no good thing." Nothing else in David's life could come close to being in God's presence. Just this year, our national movement in Sri Lanka celebrated its 40th anniversary. And in many ways, it's been an exciting year for us back home. Particularly for me, I've really enjoyed just sitting with the older generation and listening to the stories of how and why the movement was started in the first place, the conflicts that had arisen, bold decisions that had been made, challenges that they had to face, and hearing of the faithfulness and bold faith of those that had gone before us, despite the difficulties and challenges. And after every conversation, I would feel so inspired and so happy that I was a part of our national movement in at least a small way. As we think of our students back home and the movements we represent, who are some of the people that have gone before you and served as your leaders, mentors, encouraged you and inspired you, and sometimes even challenged you? What about your friends and peers, those who serve alongside you, who've been there in the ups and downs, held you accountable, but also encouraged you during the difficult times? At this moment, I would like you to do something special. For some of us, those people are here in this room with us, but for some, they're back at home. But during this day, would you reach out to them and intentionally thank them for the role that they have played in your life? What a wonderful privilege it is to be surrounded by people who have walked in the faith. We live in a world where supportive Christian community is not available for everyone. This year, IFES celebrates its 75th anniversary. And when I look around the room at all of us gathered here today from different parts of the globe, in a little way, I can understand the delight that David speaks of as he remembers the holy people in the land. So many stories in this very room that encourage us to keep going as we see the fruits of what God is doing. The question remains, though, who are we passing that legacy on to? Contrasting with the community of believers, David speaks of those that run after other gods and the suffering that they would undergo. But could we really say that is true as we look around us? Are those who have chosen to live a life that disregards God and have completely rejected his way reaping the consequences of their actions? Our present world is built on principles and values that don't necessarily reflect the kingdom. Emphasis is placed on fame, success, wealth, and knowledge. And while those things in and of themselves are not bad, in our aim to achieve them, do we end up bowing down to those idols? I think of some of the technology we use, such as ChatGPT, which is a famous one. And as much as the advancement of the technological world is quite fascinating and has added to the convenience of life, what is it that we are really using this technology for? What are the implications of it on the long run? I have friends who maybe type in a few words and there they have their university assignment ready and they give it in. But really, is that right? Is it honest? Is it fair? Does it honor those who have done the hard work before us? And more than anything, does it rob from the true learning experience of discovering and exploring and reflecting on what we are studying in our universities? We often limit this verse to those of other faiths, where those who run after other gods. But perhaps it is a call for us to inspect our own lives and see on our campuses, where have we been tempted to run after and bow down to other gods? Every little decision that you and I make reflects what matters most to us and has priority in our lives. I'm pretty sure, like many of us, David too was tempted. And we see him using this beautiful imagery to see God's provision for him. He says, "You alone are my portion and cup. You make my lot secure. The boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places." Unlike the pagan gods of that time and the blood sacrifices that needed to be offered in the hopes that those gods would somehow bless the people and shower their favor on them, we see David turning to the good God who gives first, who offers himself first, and who is always good. And perhaps this is what David means when he says that those who run after other gods would face sorrow after sorrow, because they're actually missing out on the life of abundance and goodness that God has to offer, and instead toiling behind idols that lead to temporary fulfillment and have far less to offer than what God does. The cup, on the other hand, has both negative and positive connotations in Scripture. So in Psalm 116, we see the psalmist raising a cup of salvation as a thank offering. But in the Garden of Gethsemane, we see Jesus praying that the cup would be taken away from him, as it's used as a metaphor for the pain and suffering he was about to undergo. So when David boasts of his inheritance in the Lord, he's not only including the celebration, but also the suffering. It's a part and parcel, both go hand in hand. And there are two ideas we would generally struggle to hold together. I'm aware that perhaps for some of us here, the idea of a delightful inheritance or boundary lines that have fallen in pleasant places or a secure lot may be things that we wouldn't identify with, we couldn't relate to. We come from areas or regions of conflict, areas where we are the minority. There is no religious freedom. And we feel as if though we are outcasts and aliens in our own nation. And it is to these very situations that David brings eternal perspective. In the last 4 verses of this psalm, we see the same words being quoted by Peter in the book of Acts, chapter 2, on the day of Pentecost. And in these last verses, we also find a prompting and encouragement to the listener to shift the focus from what is temporal to what is eternal. Last June, I was a bridesmaid for a wedding, and I clearly remember the instructor telling the groom, "Remember, you must always find yourself on the right side of the bride." And it's true, this was to be his pledge of protection, standing as her defense and shield, just as a soldier's bodyguard stands at his right side, protecting the soldier with his shield arm and leaving his sword arm free to deal with the enemy. And it's so beautiful to think that this is how David sees God when he says, "With him at my right hand, I will not be shaken." But what's even more interesting is how that shifts in the last verse too. "You will fill me with joy in your presence, with eternal pleasures at your right hand." A shift from my right hand to your right hand, indicating and reflecting his deep contentment in God's presence. And as a result of that contentment, we see his commitment. "I keep my eyes always on the Lord." A continuous, intentional action on his part. As I bring my message to a close, I would like all of us to close our eyes for a moment. What would it look like for you to partner with God as you build a national movement of students back home whose eyes are continually fixed on Jesus? Students who keep pursuing and running after God's presence in the face of challenge and hardship. They find their safe place in him. In these verses, Jesus is being referred to as the resurrection. And so whatever befalls us in our personal lives, on our campuses, and in our nations or across the world, because Jesus not only died on a cross, but he rose again, defeating death and every evil power, we have assurance and hope, not just for today or tomorrow or the short time we live on earth, but for all eternity. That is the hope David sets his eyes on, even when he may not have seen the fulfillment of the promise during his lifetime. This is the hope we fix our eyes on. Jesus is that hope.
Thanks for tuning in to this talk. We've got a new one dropping every Wednesday, and if you're loving what you hear, show us some love by subscribing and liking the podcast. And don't forget to stay connected with us on all social media platforms, including WhatsApp at IFES World.